Hello, hi, Harmik. Great to see you. Harmik Kazarian, who's based in Armenia. And thanks very much for coming on this call to have a conversation, see what learnings really we can get from the whole experience that we've been going through in the UK and how that compares to what's been going on in Armenia. Not a place I think a lot of UK people would typically know that much about. So the more we can learn, the better. So you're just as a quick background, Harmik, so you're in the technology space in Armenia. How, obviously you've got a very Welsh accent, so how has that ended up that you're based out of Armenia now?
Well, hello Amanda, thanks for inviting me to have this conversation. It's really exciting topics that you're covering. A little bit about my background. I grew up in Wales. I was born in Wales, and one of my parents is Armenian. After a kind of a career in consulting in the UK, I decided to make a move and live in Armenia and try to kind of learn from life here, and also apply some of the things I've learned in my career in the UK to try and kind of build the tech industry here in Armenia as well. So I've been here 4 years.
Excellent, excellent. So, and getting, yes, as you say, very different environment, but particularly now that we've gone through all this global pandemic. So I suppose overall, particularly if we're looking at from the kind of leadership perspective as a start, how's it been over there? You know, you've had the same, and you know, what stage are you at as well at this point in time regarding the whole pandemic?
I think it's fair to say we're probably in the thick of it right now.
Right.
So we're kind of at a position where our cases were rising and rising and rising, and now they're kind of starting to plateau. And hopefully we'll start to see a reduction. In terms of the kind of cases per population, we're up in some of the highest numbers actually. But the country is relatively small, which means that the absolute numbers are not so huge. But in terms of per thousand cases, we're kind of quite high up. And there are various reasons why that's happened. And the leadership overall has been, I guess, taken from the principle of transparency. So right at the beginning, the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, said that one approach he's going to take and he will not divert from is that he will always tell us everything he knows at the point he knows it. And so that has meant that we've had a lot of changing messages along the way. But the main kind of point of their approach has been transparency. And I think we've seen that relatively consistently throughout, even during times when things were not so bad, and now when we're in the thick of it. Right. I think he described it the other day as walking through hell, but we're not quite in a humanitarian crisis yet. He described the situation as that. So for a prime minister to describe the situation in his country using those kind of words is kind of interesting, but I think it does follow the transparency theme that he said.
Well, I have to say the word transparency in UK politicians are not normally put together. I think you'd find very few people that would put those in the same sentence. So that's very different. It's very different. As it worked, I suppose, you know, in terms of where you are, what kind of reaction has that been getting from people? And sorry, actually just, of course, it's all very new, the sort of overall democratic approach in Armenia, isn't it? Because was it only in 1991, I think you got the full independence from Soviet Union. So how's all that play out in terms of this transparency piece and everything for you?
Yeah, it's interesting how this kind of pandemic has brought a lot of these things to the fore. So questions about democracy and transparency and accountability to the population. After the Soviet Union collapsed, we had quite a number of years of, I guess, your kind of classic post-Soviet government, which was very non-transparent, quite a lot of corruption. For about 20 years, actually, people had lost faith in the kind of the words of politicians, and elections were kind of often touched by fraud. The revolution that happened here in 2018 was a result of those years of kind of a culmination of all of the frustrations that people had. And Nikol Pashinyan actually came to power through a peaceful revolution, which they call the Velvet Revolution, it's kind of being termed. As a result of that, the fundamental approach to government changed in the country as well. So it went from one that was more about hiding flaws, trying to mask over problems. Politicians were not approachable, for example. One of the first things they did was open the Parliament gates as a symbol for transparency, so that now the public can actually visit and directly be in the vicinity of that Parliament, which was never imaginable before. But yeah, this transparency has meant that people were not always ready for that. So there's one thing, the government being very transparent, but it's also, you have this whole legacy of people being used to treating messages from government with a lot of suspicion. Where are they trying to calculate here? What are they trying to really tell us? What does this message actually mean? That's the kind of suspicious mindset that people were in. So when the politicians, particularly Pashinyan, is telling people that, hey, we have a pandemic that's starting, things are not so bad here right now, we think we'll get through it. But then a couple of months later, when things got very bad, rightfully so, he's then saying, actually, when I said it was not so bad, actually, it's really bad now. People were kind of unable to always process that transparency, and they would be suspicious, okay, so why was he saying it was okay before, but now it's not okay? Where's the manipulation here? But actually, from a perspective of transparency, I think it's natural that you might have a number of shifts in direction, and that's what happened along the way in terms of the messages, actually.
So I suppose that suspicion that you talk about there, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, over here we kind of moaned a lot about what the governments are or aren't doing right, and they're sort of using best practice, if you like, but actually it's the people listening to that are not convinced that they're being genuine or whatever. So with that shift to kind of, oh no, it is really bad, what was the reaction, so what actually happened on the ground when, in the sense of people going, does he really mean it, or is he trying to do something funny here, or whatever? What was life like when that kind of shift happened for people on the ground?
I think there's a famously quoted press conference where the health minister held up a picture of the coronavirus, kind of the picture of the virus itself, and said, look, this is the flu virus and this is the coronavirus, and they're actually not that different. And he's being widely criticized for making that press conference right at the start, because actually it transpired they were very different. So he's saying that at that time, the information he had from the World Health Organization was that. At the time, the information he had from the World Health Organization was that masks were not necessarily effective if you're trying to use them as a preventative measure. They generally work if someone is sick. And his press conferences, coupled with Pashinyan, the Prime Minister's advice at the time, was one of kind of trying to relax people. And Pashinyan toured restaurants, for example, encouraging business and saying, it'll be okay. And then suddenly we saw the world go into lockdown. And very quickly, we had one or two cases one came from Italy, that unfortunately it kind of exploded in a factory. And then very quickly we were forced into lockdown.
Right.
And on the ground, that meant that people were not quite as afraid as perhaps they should or could have been. And so the lockdown is widely criticized as being quite loosely enforced.
Okay.
And as a result, two weeks of lockdown did bring cases down, but not to the point where we see in perhaps other more strict lockdowns that have happened around the world.
So you've only had 2 weeks and then sort of back to everything open again now, is it? Or?
Yes, actually since May the 4th, they kind of did a phased approach to reopening. So starting with kind of non-essential shops, then through to restaurant outdoor areas. One key difference, I guess, is schools have been closed right from the start, and there's no plan to open them until well into the next term, maybe even January. But this was done purely for an economic reason. The Armenian economy is quite fragile, and we are blockaded. We have closed borders with Turkey and Azerbaijan, so trade is limited just via Georgia to the EU. It's quite a difficult economic situation. So recognizing that we couldn't afford an economic collapse, and the government was unable to, say, pay wages like they stepped in to do in the UK.
Right.
They were almost had no other choice but to try and live with the virus, and that's been the key message ever since.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting there, that sort of active choice, because yes, we've had a lot of debate here in the UK, you know, the economy's crumbling, we must open up, but of course you've again got all the health officials and the scientists saying, you know, we're going to, our you know, reinfection rate, the R rate is going to go above the number that Warren and all this sort of stuff. And at the moment, well, for a long period of time, obviously the health was winning out and people were staying at home, but with the cushion of, you know, UK government payments and federal payments to an awful lot of people and businesses. Whereas interesting there then, that, okay, they've made the choice to, well, we must, you know, rescue the economy as much as we can, so we'll open up. But your cases are quite high, but you're saying they're plateauing, don't you? So it's a, yeah, there's no sort of, there's no obvious immediate right answer, is there? In that?
Yes, I think you're right.
For you.
And that's again the message from generally the government here is that unless we can learn to live with this, lockdowns are not going to be efficient. We have to learn to live as best as we can with the virus until we can find something else. And that has meant kind of, I guess what people were expecting maybe was a big push towards mask wearing, social distance, and then for the cases to go down, and then we can all kind of just relatively enjoy normality again. Yeah. What actually I think we've seen is a kind of a marathon approach where it's going to be mask wearing everywhere for the foreseeable future. Every day there are kind of raids and inspections being conducted, and they stream them live on TV, so you can see, for example, which supermarket is being raided right now.
Really?
And yes, and you can see exactly which measures the supermarket has failed on, and exactly which shops have been closed as a result. So
in terms of distancing, in terms of cleanliness, in terms of all that sort of stuff that they're not putting in place.
Yes.
Wow.
So, for example, if you don't have a record of all of the employees' temperature checks that are done 3 times a day, that's kind of an immediate closure offence, and you have to do that.
Okay.
If restaurants are not taking the temperatures of their customers when they enter, that's also an offence for closure.
Okay.
So we've seen this. This has been now for about six to 7 weeks, and the R rate at the last time the Prime Minister mentioned it a couple of days ago is 1.1. It's gone down from 1.4 to now about 1.1, and we're hoping that it will keep edging downwards.
Yeah. And that's with obviously no lockdown so you came out of that, well, sort of phased early May. So that's over a month now that you're essentially back to everybody walking around and all that sort of stuff. So
yes.
Well, it's really interesting, that different approach. Yes. So, you know, we're kind of just opening up now. In fact, it'll be was the latest is 4th of July is a big sort of opening up, lots of stuff that's coming up. And yeah, people are very worried, you know, there's sort of people desperate to go and get their businesses up and running, but there are lots of other people saying, well, I'm not going to go anywhere, even though it's all open. So fascinating to see how it does pan out in that. I mean, it feels like the lockdown has happened in a much more sort of localized way. So we will shut that supermarket, we will shut that restaurant, as opposed to everything's closed, you know.
Exactly,
if you're not doing what you're supposed to. So there's a kind of quite a much stricter enforcement in some ways than yeah, I mean, I suppose, well, do they have the capacity to be able to patrol all these, you know, supermarkets and restaurants and all the rest of it from a policing and enforcement perspective? Is that easy, or is that hard? Or?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and it's again part of the changes that were supposed to happen as part of the revolution that the new government has put forward was a new civil police force, and it's unfortunate that that's due to happen next year, and actually the police force is relatively under-resourced. And so what they've had to do is, in light of the state of emergency, so by law, we're in a state of emergency still, which gives the government extra powers to kind of mobilize other teams that maybe would not necessarily deal with food inspections, but they are.
Yeah.
So they've kind of mobilized as much resource as they can. and are deploying them in a targeted way. And we've had sort of also localized lockdowns, like you said. A particular town was locked down about 2 weeks ago. All entrance in and out of that town was barred. And unfortunately, we're also seeing some kind of people. Some people are politicizing the use of masks, for example, and it's the sort of, we're seeing some of the opposition parties, for example, refusing to wear masks because it's seen as loyalty. If you listen to the government, then you're somehow loyal to them. I think that the anti-corona measures are so heavily linked to the government itself that it's almost kind of one and the same. If you listen to them, you're on their side. If you protest, you're almost not on their side, which I think is a key difference in the UK, where the health kind of, and the science thinking has been quite separated from government, and in terms of the way they've addressed people, you know.
Yes, yeah, I think it's sort of, maybe there's an element of the PR in this as well. But yeah, so if you take the Conservative government might be saying this needs to happen. Labour government will not be saying no, don't do that. They will be, questioning the government in terms of how many tests are done, why did this not do the way it was going to go. But they're quite united almost in terms of the message to be, stay at home or whatever it is that that they're coming out with. So yes, it sounds like there's more unity politically in that context, and you've got those factions playing against each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it just comes from the position or the condition that Armenia is in right now, in terms of a very kind of lots of polls of opinion straight after. We're only 1.5, 2 years after a revolution, so there's a lot of extreme ideas, and lots of people maybe don't want this to succeed, and yeah, there's a lot more there than just, I think, the health measures, which to me are kind of indisputable for all intents and purposes.
Yes, yeah, no, fascinating. So, so you mentioned earlier on that, and with both the Prime Minister and that example of the supermarkets there, that everything's streamed on the TV. So is it very easy to get information and updates about what the latest situation is? Do you feel that, can somebody be very informed very quickly, or is it quite hard, or are people bothered to be informed, or what's your view of the kind of the way people have been engaged and the population's been engaged around all of this?
I think from my perspective, as I guess I represent a kind of maybe a younger age group, or someone who's using the internet to get news. From that perspective, for me, it's been very easy. So in the first days of the pandemic, the government set up a specific, it's called the Armenian Unified Information Center. It's one Facebook and site which only deals with coronavirus. So every morning at 11 a.m. they publish the previous night's test numbers, the previous night's death figures, and the previous night's positive cases. And everybody knows at 11 a.m. and everybody messages each other at 11 a.m. with how many was it today. So that from that perspective, it's very transparent. One thing I guess they did in the beginning, which they've slightly changed, is in the beginning a lot of the messaging from the Prime Minister and the government was done via social media. So they were going online, streaming from their offices. The Health Minister was streaming from his office, giving updates in this manner. And then they've kind of shifted to a more kind of, I'd say probably a more formal and institutional style of communication. I think in line with the fact that maybe people weren't taking it seriously enough. So now we have more of a UK style briefing every evening as well, where the Prime Minister will invite either one other minister and a representative of either the science community or the medical community. And then 2 journalists are allowed to ask questions remotely, and then they close, and the same thing happens every day. So it's a shift from kind of social media based interaction through to more of a, I guess, a formalized approach. And this is all very new for Armenia, because we didn't have many of the tools that, for example, in the UK, you have, I don't know, the Gov.uk website, which you can get all the, that's official information, you can go there. We didn't necessarily have this level of kind of government information source. So this has all been something very new.
Yeah, yeah. Well, interesting you mentioned that as well, because as of yesterday, our daily briefings have stopped. The government have decided they're just going to do them as and when necessary in terms of those formal stand at the podium briefings.
Right.
Two schools of thought on that one as to whether that's a wise decision or not. But from your, in Armenia, they're still going on there, so you can still expect a daily government update of some sort or other.
Yes, yeah, every day at the moment, and it happens directly after the emergency committee. So I guess maybe it's the kind of COBRA equivalent in the UK. So the Prime Minister chairs it, and then directly after there is a press conference that he does from the government sitting. And he was interesting. The Prime Minister also got infected with coronavirus. So this is maybe an interesting point about the transparency. About 3 weeks ago, his entire family were infected with coronavirus.
Oh, crikey.
And he went on Facebook and said, I messed up. I probably didn't wear a mask at some point.
Really?
I'm urging you all to make sure you do that so you don't end up like my family. So yeah, it's been. But then of course you had the backlash of, has he really got corona, or is he just doing it to make us all feel scared? Because there was also that reaction. So it kind of illustrates the point of how suspicious people are.
Yeah. Well, but so again, different. So we both had prime ministers who caught it, but I don't remember. Albeit it sounds like, I mean, Boris Johnson had it very bad, in terms of he was in intensive care and on. So I don't know whether the prime minister was as bad as that in Armenia.
No, he didn't even have a temperature, and within 5 days they tested negative again. So the thinking is that he caught it a while back, and they identified it at the tail end. Right. None of them had any symptoms.
Yeah, right. Yes, but again, that it's just bringing that whole point of transparency out, isn't it, in terms of sharing that. I don't, thankfully, Boris Johnson came out the other side, and he's back and fighting fit as much as you can be after having been in intensive care. But I don't recall him ever saying I shouldn't have shaken all those hands. In fact, he made a point, right early on, to shake lots of people's hands before the big impact actually hit. And then there have been other members of the government who've also done things that are actually opposite from what the government advice was doing. But similarly, they all seem to be still in their jobs, not taking the approach that you're suggesting now about saying, oh, sorry, I must have messed up somewhere, but please don't do what I did, type of message. Yeah, very, very, very different approach. So the how is it actually all of that sort of understanding what the government's been trying to put in place, but recognizing some of the built-in suspicion and all the rest of it of everyday Armenians. What sort of impacts have, what's it been like for businesses, small, medium, large businesses, given all of this, and how are they doing? How are they getting through it?
I think it's challenging, like anywhere, I guess. We had some interesting data yesterday, which the Prime Minister announced again on Facebook, but so when they locked down, there was a formal loss of about 70,000 jobs instantly. And for a country of just 3 million people, that's a huge impact on the economy. What he's saying now is that based on the income tax returns from the last month, 50,000 of those jobs have been reinstated. But that still leaves a delta of 20,000 jobs, which we need to kind of regain. And it's likely that those are coming from places like the tourism sector, which is completely stopped right now. Most of Armenia's economy is made up of light industry, so factories, which are very difficult if there's an outbreak, and they were all closed. Yeah. Now they're open again. Then you have also the technology sector, which is largely unaffected, fortunately. That's about 7% of the economic output. Right. Tourism is rising, say 20% every year, and it was seen as the big year for tourism in Armenia. We had Ryanair launching flights in March, and now they've stopped. So right. you have a kind of a big group of people who are largely waiting for the season, and it's likely not to happen. Just, I guess, from a visual side of things, looking around in the cafes outside, there are people. It's visibly quieter. Restaurants are visibly quieter. So I think we've been quite heavily impacted. And as I said earlier, the government doesn't really have the full financial resource to be able to push kind of paying people's wages and so on. So the message is that if you can keep the epidemiological measures like the masks and the temperature checking, we can relatively work freely, and that it's kind of, they're trying to incentivize business to take these measures on so that they can continue working.
Right, yes. So the what about, are they, I suppose, like the supermarkets then and places like that, is it a concern if they don't follow the measures, you know, because it might be difficult for them to, do they worry about things like reputation and risk to that? Or, you know, do people shun a company that has been seen to be, you know, not doing the right thing and risking everybody catching it or not? Is that a big concern in terms of being seen to be doing the right thing from a business perspective?
I think it does, and we've had cases like that here, where one interesting example is there's quite a well-known chocolate brand here that had cases, and they were kind of open about making sure that they told people that, you know, we have these cases, and they were able to close and isolate the people who had them. And I think generally people respond well to that. It's a little bit scary because it's food production, but I think that transparency is important. We've had similarly the opposite kind of case where big textile factory, there was a number of workers that were infected, but they were forced to close actually because they weren't keeping the measures in place. And we had a case where the workers actually protested along with the owner of the factory, you know, we want to open, and then a couple of weeks later they had a big surge in cases, and I think it does damage the reputation of the company, and seeing the owner taking part in protests about closure, and then seeing that they've got a lot of cases afterwards, kind of, I think it ultimately will do damage to businesses who don't comply. And similarly, you can see a lot businesses who are actively promoting safe, you know, social distancing and wearing masks and all of those measures. They're being promoted actively now, either by the government or by people, you know, post a photo if you go somewhere where you see a really good example of how to do it. And we had examples where, for example, banks were called up quite a lot because queuing outside banks became a massive problem. And so you had people posting photos of, you know, this bank is really good, this bank is not doing so well. And it almost became a competition then, who can organize the social distancing measures the best. So.
Well, you know, we should have a championship on that in the UK, wouldn't you think? Who could have the best queue, given our years of experience? But
that is one thing
have the
that
best socially distant queue.
Yeah, the queuing is something that culturally has always been a bit of a challenge, and Armenians tend to queue in kind of in orderly lines, but that's just, I guess, a tradition. And it's something that they've also mentioned here, that this is an opportunity to change this culture and for us to stand in an orderly line when we queue, and maybe it will stay with us after the pandemic is over. So yeah.
Interesting. So, I mean, that's all, like, you know, obviously like the banks, they've got, and as that example, there's a lot of change in, you know, that they've got to bring in very rapidly. So they've got to be quite flexible. Things like banks, and there's also, making back to some of the things you're talking about, the government, you know, public sector overall, certainly in the UK. And those traditional areas like banks are not meant to be very flexible, quick to respond, you know, and being able to do stuff, new things like that. How, and I'm guessing it from a sort of the history of, you know, the government framework within Armenia, that some, you know, change was probably potentially even slower in the public sector than it might have been even in, you know, other European countries that weren't under the same kind of regime. So has that been any different, given that we've had all this going on, or is that, you know, has that hampered them, or has that helped them, or how you could, the pace of change of what it was to what it has to be now?
I think it's forced a big shift in digitization and bringing a lot of services online. I mean, I know that, for example, the UK has some very, very effective public services that are already online, and you can do most things online now in the UK. Armenia's case was slightly different. So the private sector had pretty much outpaced the government in terms of digitization. So you can do most things. Most private sector businesses, you can order, I don't know, the man who fixes your boiler, you can order it online, you can order your groceries online. That side was pretty mature.
Right.
On the other hand, the public sector, the public services, like you said, exactly, they've been very slow to adopt these kind of changes, and they were almost forced to in the context of the pandemic. So there's an example I could bring about, for example, car registrations. There has been talk for years about digitizing how you register your car when you buy a new car and you get a number plate. You traditionally had to go to a big police office and wait in line, and obviously this then becomes impossible because it's a health risk.
Yeah.
The government recently released a new approach where you can just send an email with the required documents and get the registration back online. And it's yes, it's a little clunky maybe, and it's maybe not the perfect thing we would like to see, but it kind of goes to show that you can, if you need to, you can enforce change, or you can bring people towards a change very fast. And I think now it's a case of building on these things that have been done. I personally, I'm very interested to see if we will go back to the old way afterwards. So an example I have is that every 3 months there's a scheme where you get your income tax back. If you have a mortgage, you can claim your tax back, which I would do. It's a nice scheme, but it means that every 3 months you have to walk to the tax office, show the same paper, fill in the same form, and then wait. And I was doing this, and it really drives me crazy. But they've also digitized this process, for example. And for the first time, I was able to do it all from my house. And within 10 days, I had the money. And I'm wondering, is this going to be something that we will see permanently? I think it has to be.
Presumably people have been sort of moaning about, why do I have to do this for months, years? I don't know how long that scheme's been in existence. And so from what you're saying, if you went down, I'm just trying to think when it all kind of really hit, but say it was January, February time, I'm assuming when it really hit up. So in the space of what, 2 months?
Yes.
Roughly. They've got that from nothing to being able to do it by email or whatever, despite several years of it, people saying this really should be done better,
Yeah, I mean, I know I was saying it for at least 2 years, so.
Right.
But the government has admitted this as well, and they've acknowledged that one thing they've said is we have the data that's around about citizens, all of the different public bodies that keep data on people. None of those systems talk to each other. Largely, like I think it was similarly in the UK, probably quite about 10 or 15 years ago when we had this problem, and I know there's a lot of effort being made since, but the Prime Minister called on this pandemic as an opportunity to consolidate all of these databases. He even said it in the government sitting, let's just do it now. We have to do it now. Let's bite the bullet and change this. And it happened. So for example, when the government started giving state aid to parents of young children, it's an interesting example. If you were a working parent and you had children, you were entitled to state aid. The problem was that the data on who is a working parent was held with the tax, so I guess the HMRC equivalent, and the data on the children was held with the social ministry or something like that. Right. And they couldn't marry these two up to figure out who should get the aid. That was a huge thing that was done as a result of the pandemic, and it means in the future when we have these kind of targeted tax credit systems or whatever, they can be quite easily implemented in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating. So they managed to do that, and it was purely Corona that sort of drove that. We've got to just get it done.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Very impressive. So I suppose do you think, given that they've now done a few of those, what do you think the outlook is, particularly from the whole digitization more broadly, in the economy? What do you think that looks like now, given the experience of the last few months? What opportunities might there be, or which way do you think it might go in Armenia? Technology.
I think it's probably highlighted once again the importance of the technology sector for the country in terms of its future. I think, I don't have the exact numbers, but it's pretty clear that, for example, if you're a programmer, you are earning probably up to 5 to 8, even 10 times the average wage. And so if you have just one programmer in a family working on digital technology, they could potentially, during this pandemic, be supporting their own family, their extended family, their parents, to help them through the crisis.
Yeah.
I think we'll probably see a renewed push for expanding the technology sector in Armenia after this.
Yeah, yeah.
And we'll probably see a lot more jobs in the technology sector because of that. And it's not to say they weren't incentivizing it before, but I think its importance has been really amplified as a result of the crisis. And manufacturing, in terms of light manufacturing, that will probably continue to be big. But it's mainly the technology that I think people will realize is going to drive the economy in the future in terms of the highly paid jobs that. And from the people I know, I don't know of anyone that's been laid off. There could well be, but I don't know anyone in the technology sector that's been laid off just yet. I think they're waiting it out.
Yeah, yeah. So it feels like a bit, do you think you're heading into a sort of like Estonia type, explosion of technology maybe, because they went from sort of nothing to, again, with very specific investment and things like that in broadband and all the rest of it, to particularly government services, everything online, way more than we have in the UK and stuff like that. So maybe, could it be going down that sort of path, do you think, for technology?
I'd love to see it. I think we have to, personally.
Right.
And I know that the government's been working on their national digital strategy for a good few years. Before the revolution, it was almost done, and then it got scrapped and they started a new one.
Right.
So we're hoping to get it through the parliament soon, and I've been putting some input into that with a team that's working on it. But
Right.
there really needs to be a concerted approach to getting that done, because I think if we do want to have an economy that's driven by technology, the government services that back that infrastructure up have to be, if not better, at least as good as the private sector technology solutions. So if I want to register to vote, or register to have someone collect my commercial waste, or fit an electricity line, this needs to be so easy that anyone doing business can just do it very fast. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. So I think if the government needs to keep pace with the technology sector, the private sector, in order to drive further growth. And I think they do recognize it. I'd like to see it faster, to be honest. And Estonia would be a dream model for us. And the size of the country is similar.
Yeah.
And it's entirely possible. And if you compare to the UK, where, for example, you may be dealing with a lot of legacy systems that you need to kind of port to new systems, and all of that takes time. We may be able to skip a few steps here because we don't have necessarily as many of those big kind of older legacy systems that you need to work with.
Right. Yeah. But I suppose coming back to where we were talking earlier on about the history of Armenia and things like that. So you've got all these sort of getting, sort of technology ambition and all the rest of it, but you've also got a population who, and particularly, I assume, I'm not wishing to generalize, but the older population who are, are steeped in a different kind of approach to life and things like that. How do you think that, how that can work to bring those people, is that something that the, whether it's government or other bodies or whatever, are trying to do to sort of help the average Joe feel like they're moving into more of a technological age, or not?
I think it's a really interesting point, because I was just recently traveling some of the regions in Armenia a couple of days back, and it's really apparent how there are so many different realities in this country where you have a booming technology sector, but there are villages where agriculture and working the land is the main way people live. And I've been thinking, how can you, I guess the challenge is to bring the technology that you kind of discover and deliver as part of this booming sector, how do you deliver it to those people living in rural villages? I think one of the first things that has been done, and I consider it to be a good success, is the availability of internet, and that I think is the base for any of these changes. So I was in a village yesterday that's in the middle of nowhere. The road is mud. There is no tarmac. There is barely a couple of street lights, but there was 4G plus internet, and I did a speed test, and I was getting 60, 70 megabits internet on my phone. And I visited a technology center there actually yesterday, which is teaching the kids in that village how to build robots and do programming. And it's I guess maybe those kids who will go home and help their parents, I don't know, set up a bank account online, or maybe retrain. We're talking probably a generation, but that's I think what's going to happen. And it all starts with the availability of that basic internet, which I think in some ways is maybe even more important than a road. It's the road of the future, the internet, because it means you can travel between anywhere without the need to get on a car or anything,
Yes, yeah. And it's making me think also, there's quite a few sort of African countries, also I think in places like India and things, where actually they've sort of leapfrogged a lot of the steps that some of the older industrial nations have gone through, because as soon as you've got one of these in your hand, and you can access banking services and access all kinds, you don't need to have the physical infrastructure there. So it's been done elsewhere, absolutely. If they've already got the broadband there, it's about then how, so they get familiar with it and use it and make it live for them. I think that'd be very interesting to see, and probably less than generation, because if the young kids are doing, as you say, in those sorts of colleges and classes, go home, get grandparents and parents up and running. Even I have to, help my mum with the internet and stuff like that. There's always that age divide, isn't it? But the sooner they're used to using it, the better. It just reminds me, actually, I mean, here in the UK, we've been going through a lot of homeschooling, and my daughter's 9. I was talking to somebody yesterday thinking, she's 9 now, and she's very comfortable doing online Zoom classes, and, everything is connected through, Google Docs and whatever else research. And she's done that now from the age of 9. So if she hits the workplace in 10 years time, or 10, 15 years time, whatever it is, she will have been doing that for 10 years, this kind of instant interaction. I'll still be at work, and I'll have these people at this age with that kind of, recognition of technology and how you use it and all the rest of it. And it'll be the oldies like me thinking, I can't keep up. But it's a very different world of work then, for as these people into the workforce and deliver stuff.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about how, in terms of if you are in a rural setting, and agriculture is very important, I think, and I know there are some steps being taken, but I think it should be a lot more, how you can educate the rural population to, let's say, how you make sure your crops are not damaged by certain bugs or certain, parasites, or all of this information, making it available online somehow into those communities, I think is going to be really important. And I know there is some work being done now they're calling it digital agriculture, but exactly what it is, I'm not sure. But there's a couple of projects that they're doing to try and combat these kind of issues, and also the introduction of technologies that enable effective farming. So irrigation of water, when you water your crops, you do it with a hose pipe, but we know that drip irrigation is the best way, where it kind of slowly feeds the crops. I know there's some startups here working on kind of automated systems that use sensors around the farms to check how much water is in the soil and then give it the exact amount. And they're young people. I met one of the guys who had this idea a few months back, and very young, and he was inspired by life that he had in his village and seen this problem firsthand, and applying the programming skills that you get hopefully should breed a generation that will create those kind of solutions.
Yeah. It's funny to think of, so you may have some acreage in the middle of nowhere, essentially, growing the crops. There's, as you say, there's no road, it's a mud road, but actually the management of those crops is done through, information coming from drones, it's coming from sensors, electronic sensors doing the appropriate water flow, whatever. And yet if you try and drive a car down the road to get to the farmhouse, you know,
Yeah.
your suspension is really going to die. So that kind of mix of the old and the new, absolutely, to get into the future. So
yes, it's it's a bit of a funny story, but I was looking at some places in these villages yesterday, and I was thinking, okay, if you were to, let's say, have some land here, how would you protect it? And obviously my mind went to technology. Okay, I'd put a camera here, I'd put this there, and this automatic thing here. And I was thinking, okay, what about the internet, though? This is going to be a problem. I asked the guy who was showing me around, and he said, no, I've got this network 4G, this network 3G, this one 4G plus, you should take this one. I thought, this guy knows. He's obviously had this problem. And yeah, so I think it's very important.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating just to kind of get an insight into places like Armenia, because you know we can sit here sit there in the UK thinking, oh, you know, we've got it all under control, and small countries like teach us anything. But actually, some of the big issues that you're facing are, and the results that are coming out of it, whether it be the COVID pieces and some of the way government has reacted, you know, I could argue that are more forward-thinking than, you know, countries like the UK, where we're seem to be a bit more reluctant to learn from either our mistakes or the good practice of other people as well. Particularly given you've got a very difficult, much more difficult context to work with, where the country's come from very, very recently. So fascinating insight into how it's all going in over there. So we've kind of covered a load of different things. I suppose the key things that were coming out from what you're saying is well, we've talked a lot about that word transparency. And so whilst it's been used a lot, and it's had sort of, you know, it's not all plain sailing, but from how you've described it, that seems to have been quite a major factor in terms of getting people through and continuing to get people through this crisis, because you're still in the middle of it now. And I think that's also had an interesting impact in terms of people's willingness to obey by it. And the way also there's been the transparency you can watch on TV, which supermarket has been raided or whatever, you know, so you're learning from mistakes as well as the best practices on you go. So that's fantastic. And I think there's also great lessons to learn from, you know, speed and flexibility, whether it be in government or business, where actually you probably didn't start off with all the benefits of some of the things we've already got up and running, for example, in the UK, but you still managed to quickly move and jump a few fences much faster than some of the decision making or sort of, I'm thinking our track and trace, for example, you know, that on the NHS and the app, you know, they spent a lot of time investing in an app as to what was going to work, chose not to go with the other ones for about, I don't know, a month or two, and then we get the message, oh no, that's no good, we'll go with the others, whatever. You think, well, why do we do things like that? Whereas it sounds like some things, I mean, you've just gone and made something happen, and then they're learning and adapting it as you're going forward. So loads of really interesting insights. Thank you for that. Well, I suppose looking at it overall then, just as a sort of final view of it, what do you think the sort of experience has been like in Armenia overall in terms of the learning that Armenia will probably take from this whole piece when hopefully everybody gets through the other side, you know?
I really hope that the transparency that the government has shown pays off. I think traditionally, maybe in politics and even sometimes in business, sometimes we're convinced that it's not always best to be transparent. You know, you need to massage the message and get the right thing out. And I hope that people will realize that when we get through this difficult part and we look back, we will think that actually the transparency was the right thing to do. And I hope that that's the approach that citizens will start to take towards doing business with each other, or the way they perceive the messages they get from their government. I hope this will be a huge learning for people. And also the silly things like queuing in a better manner, but that's just a small thing. But I think the main thing is, I really hope that the transparency approach works. Because if it doesn't, it questions a whole load of theory and a whole load of things that we've known to be correct for a long time. We always think it's best to be honest. I hope that works out.
Yeah. And I suppose so. And if you are transparent, you're saying it's okay to get it wrong. They're just going to shoot you down claims if it's gone a bit wrong, because you say, oops, did what we thought was right, went wrong, doing something else now. But you don't get crucified for having done that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, I think I think a lot of people in sort of positions of leadership, certainly in the UK, would be too worried about being really shot down claims for saying, oh God, sorry, we got it all wrong, we'll do something different now. Well, it'd be absolutely fascinating to see over the next sort of couple of months how it all pans out, and actually revisiting this in a few months to see have those, what of those things are stuck, what is happening now become more embedded in general life in Armenia. So thank you so much for taking us through that. That's been really fascinating and a great learning experience. And
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
hopefully we'll have some more conversations going forward in terms of other lessons learned from Armenia. Thanks so much, Harvey.
Thanks, Amanda.